This will have you questioning just how safe the stars really are, starting with David Letterman, who for over a decade dealt with much more than just his audience's admiration. He was haunted by a stalker, Margaret Ray. She was convinced they were destined to be together. Ray didn't see herself as just another fan. She believed she was Letterman's wife. What followed was a string of unsettling incidents that went way beyond fan obsession. Ray didn't just admire from afar, she broke into Letterman's home repeatedly, and acting like she lived there. In one of the most bizarre moments, she stole his Porsche. She was later found casually driving it around, genuinely believing she was simply returning to her husband. And this wasn't a one-off. Ray even camped out in his driveway for days. She would make herself at home in a reality that only existed in her mind. Each time she was caught, it became clearer just how far her delusions had spiraled. Despite being arrested multiple times, Ray's obsession never faded. Her mental health struggles were at the heart of this tragic saga, but the legal system couldn't seem to offer a solution that would protect either her or Letterman. It was a vicious cycle. Ray's unstable behavior was followed by arrests and releases, only to repeat the pattern again and again. In a heartbreaking twist, Ray took her own life in 1998. This left behind a story that raised more questions than answers about how such cases are handled. Letterman often joked about the ordeal on his show, but the reality was much darker. But as unsettling as Letterman's story is, Steven Spielberg faced something even more terrifying. A stalker whose plans went beyond admiration and straight into a nightmare. Spielberg, Hollywood's legendary director, became the target of Jonathan Norman in the late 1990s. And trust me, this guy wasn't just a fan with a crush. His intentions were dark, dangerous, and chilling. Norman wasn't content with fan mail or standing outside Spielberg's gates. Nope, he broke into the director's estate armed, and we're not talking about a camera for autographs. This man came prepared with duct tape and handcuffs, fully intending to abduct and harm Spielberg and his family. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. This wasn't just another celebrity stalker story. It was a full-on, premeditated attack. Lucky for Spielberg, his security team was on point. Norman was caught before he could carry out his terrifying plans. When police nabbed him, the evidence was like something straight out of a horror movie. There was no question that Norman's obsession had crossed every possible line. And Spielberg? Well, he had to testify in court, reliving the fear that haunted his family for months. Norman was slapped with a 25-year sentence, but the trauma for Spielberg didn't disappear with the verdict. The whole ordeal shook his world, a world he once thought was safe behind Hollywood gates. While Spielberg's ordeal involved a stranger's dark obsession, Michael Douglas found himself in an even more chilling situation, one that threatened not just him but his entire family. In the early 2000s, Dawnette Knight, a woman obsessed with Douglas, became convinced that they were meant to be together. But in her warped reality, there was one major obstacle in her way: Douglas's wife, actress Catherine Zeta-Jones. Knight's obsession took on dangerous proportions. Over the course of months, she sent more than 24 terrifying letters directly to Zeta-Jones, each more disturbing than the last. In one letter, Knight chillingly claimed she would slice up Zeta-Jones and feed her remains to her dogs, a horrifying threat that pushed the situation to the brink. As if the violent letters weren't enough, Knight started to contact them through hotels and agents, trying to get closer to the family. The tension in their household skyrocketed as Zeta-Jones became genuinely fearful for her life, with the constant anxiety of being targeted by someone so dangerously delusional. The breaking point came when Knight was finally arrested. This brought a temporary sense of relief, but the emotional damage had already been done. In court, it was revealed that Knight's fixation on Douglas had been simmering for years. She had built a complete fantasy world where she believed Douglas was the love of her life, and Zeta-Jones was the only thing standing between them. Her willingness to do whatever it took to remove her perceived rival made the ordeal even more frightening. Even after Knight's arrest and the subsequent legal battles, the trauma didn't magically disappear. Knight was issued a restraining order, but the fear that had taken hold of Douglas and Zeta-Jones lingered. But Douglas wasn't alone. Across town, Madonna's stalker took things far beyond words. It leaves her life in complete turmoil. In the early 1990s, Madonna faced an utterly terrifying situation that escalated far past fan mail. Robert Dewey Hoskins didn't beat around the bush with his intentions. His demands were crystal clear. If she didn't marry him, he would eliminate her. And this wasn't some idle threat. Hoskins even scaled the fence of her property, fully determined to carry out his deadly plan. Though Hoskins was arrested and sentenced to prison, that wasn't the end of Madonna's nightmare. The relief was short-lived because the most terrifying twist came later. Hoskins escaped from a mental health facility. The man who had once promised to take her life was suddenly free, sending Madonna into a state of constant fear. It didn't matter how many bodyguards she had. Knowing that someone who had made such chilling threats was roaming free would shake anyone to their core. Fortunately, Hoskins was eventually recaptured. But by then, the emotional damage had already been done. Madonna's sense of safety had been shattered. Fame and fortune couldn't insulate her from the disturbing reality of a stalker who was willing to go to such extreme lengths. Another star who faced something just as relentless was Alec Baldwin, whose stalker wouldn't leave him or his family in peace. In 2012, Baldwin found himself ensnared in a disturbing ordeal with Genevieve Sabaran. He was a Canadian actress who became fixated on him and convinced herself they were in a romantic relationship. Sabaran's obsession escalated rapidly. She bombarded Baldwin with countless emails and phone calls, and if that wasn't enough, she even showed up unannounced at his Hamptons home, crossing every possible line. Baldwin's attempts to ignore her went nowhere. In fact, the situation only intensified. Sabaran took her obsession public, showing up at a film screening where Baldwin was present. She would cause an embarrassing scene that left Baldwin with no choice but to involve the police. The fear wasn't just about the disruption in his public life, it was about the uncertainty of what Sabaran might do next. The unpredictability of an obsessed stalker is a chilling reality no amount of fame can protect against. Eventually, Sabaran was arrested and convicted of stalking. But the emotional damage was already done. The toll on Baldwin and his wife was profound. Court appearances and ongoing legal battles became a recurring part of their lives as they fought to end Sabaran's obsessive behavior. Yet not all stars are as fortunate. Sandra Bullock discovered that sometimes a stalker doesn't stop at the door, they break right through it. In 2014, she experienced a nightmare come to life. Fast asleep in her Los Angeles mansion, Bullock was jolted awake by strange noises in the middle of the night. Heart pounding, she locked herself in a closet and dialed 911.
There's someone banging on the door.
Through the door, she could hear the intruder, Joshua Corbett, rummaging through her house.
I can't hear anything. I'm locked in my closet. It's a safe door and it's shut.
He moved closer with every sound. Corbett hadn't just broken in on a whim. When police arrived and arrested him,
Tell us what the person was wearing, what color pants.
All I saw was like dark sweatshirt and dark pants going up the stairs to my attic.
they found a disturbing notebook filled with obsessive letters to Bullock. This outlines his unhealthy fixation. He hadn't come empty-handed either. Investigators later discovered he had a stash of illegal weapons. This wasn't a case of casual trespassing. Corbett was armed with plans that went far beyond a fan's obsession. Corbett was convicted of felony stalking and burglary in 2017, but even after his arrest, the story didn't end. Corbett's mental state remained a concern, and he was sentenced to mental health treatment and probation. A restraining order was issued, but in 2018, things took a darker turn. Corbett barricaded himself inside his home during a tense standoff with police. It ultimately ended in tragedy when he took his own life. His obsession had pushed him over the edge, showing just how dangerous these situations can become. Meanwhile, Gwyneth Paltrow was grappling with a different kind of terror. A man who spent more than a decade relentlessly haunting her life. Dante Soyu, an obsessed fan, sent her hundreds of letters over the course of 10 long years. These letters weren't just the ramblings of a devoted admirer. They veered from religious rants to disturbingly explicit messages that left Paltrow in a constant state of unease. As if that wasn't unsettling enough, Soyu even sent inappropriate gifts, and heightening her anxiety with each new delivery. Despite being arrested multiple times and with a restraining order in place, Soyu's fixation didn't wane. In fact, it only seemed to intensify. Paltrow found herself facing him in court repeatedly, with each appearance reinforcing the harsh reality that her stalker wasn't going to simply disappear. The legal battles were draining, but the real toll was the emotional burden of knowing that no matter what she did, Soyu's obsession wasn't going away. A decade of this relentless behavior took a heavy toll on Paltrow's sense of safety and security. The constant influx of disturbing letters and inappropriate gifts left her questioning whether this nightmare would ever truly end. It didn't matter how many precautions she took, Soyu's presence lingered in her life like an unwanted shadow. But while her torment was drawn out over time, Britney Spears faced a much more immediate and deeply personal threat. In 2022, her ex-husband, Jason Alexander, turned what should have been one of the happiest days of her life, her wedding to Sam Asghari, into a terrifying ordeal. This wasn't a random stalker, it was someone she had once trusted enough to marry, even if their union had only lasted 55 hours back in 2004. Alexander, a childhood friend of Spears, brazenly trespassed onto her property on the day of her wedding, even live-streaming himself as he wandered through her home, claiming he was there to crash the ceremony. For Spears, this invasion wasn't just a breach of physical security, it was a profound betrayal. She had once shared her life, albeit briefly, with Alexander, and now he was violating her most private and vulnerable moment. Security intervened just in time, stopping Alexander before he could cause further disruption. He was swiftly arrested and later charged with felony stalking, along with several other charges. A restraining order was issued, but the damage had already been done. Even with legal protection in place, the emotional fallout was undeniable. But it wasn't just Spears dealing with the fear of unwanted visitors. Taylor Swift also found herself in a similar situation. However, her stalker took things to a much darker level. Imagine being one of the world's biggest pop stars and discovering that someone is determined to not only ruin your career but harm you personally. Swift has faced her share of stalkers, but Eric Swarbrick's obsession took things to a terrifying extreme. Swarbrick made headlines for sending chilling letters and threats to Swift's label, but he didn't stop there. He didn't just write, he showed up. In 2018, Swarbrick drove from Texas to Nashville several times, demanding to meet her. When his requests were denied, his letters became even more disturbing. These became threats against her safety that shook everyone involved. Even with legal action in place, the fear didn't disappear. Swift had to implement extreme security measures, now constantly looking over her shoulder as she toured and performed. The idea that someone was out there with harmful intentions made the situation feel impossible to escape. Swarbrick was eventually arrested, but the emotional impact stayed with Swift long after. It was a frightening and drawn-out process before she could feel even a hint of normalcy again. Rihanna found herself facing something equally chilling when a man not only broke into her home, but refused to leave. In May 2018, her Los Angeles home became the scene of a real-life nightmare. It was when Eduardo Leon, a man who had been obsessively stalking her online, invaded her property and stayed. He didn't break in to steal valuables, he was there for her. After hopping the fence and sneaking into her Hollywood Hills mansion, Leon spent a staggering 12 hours inside waiting for her to return. He even disabled the home's alarm system, showing just how determined and prepared he was. When police finally apprehended Leon, he calmly admitted that he had been waiting for Rihanna. He's fully convinced that they were meant to be together. His chilling confidence that this invasion was somehow justified only made the situation more disturbing. Although Rihanna wasn't home at the time, the knowledge that a stranger had spent hours lurking in her house expecting her return was enough to send shockwaves through her. Leon was charged with stalking, burglary, and vandalism. He also faced additional charges for criminal trespass and tampering with the security system. Facing up to 6 years in prison, his arrest didn't fully erase the deep sense of violation that Rihanna experienced. But she wasn't the only young star dealing with an obsessed fan. Miley Cyrus has had her fair share of unwanted attention. In 2009, things took a dangerous turn when a man named Mark McCloud was arrested twice for attempting to reach Cyrus while she was filming on Tybee Island, Georgia. McCloud, who was utterly convinced that he and the teen star were engaged, lurked near the film set. He was claiming he had sent her diamond rings and received secret messages through her TV show, Hannah Montana. In his delusion, he believed that these signals were proof of their destined relationship. Despite being arrested and jailed, McCloud's obsession didn't fade. After his first release, he shockingly returned to Tybee Island, undeterred. He began knocking on doors near the film set, asking bewildered locals if they knew where he could find Cyrus. The situation escalated further when he was arrested again, and even after being sentenced to probation and ordered to stay away from the young star and her family, McCloud's dangerous delusions continued. For Cyrus, the psychological toll of dealing with such an obsessed and unpredictable individual was undeniable. She had to ramp up her security measures, always living with the unsettling knowledge that her stalker refused to let go of his fantasy. But while her stalker was obsessed with the idea of marriage, Kendall Jenner's stalker had a much more disturbing fixation, one that crossed every boundary of privacy. Jenner might be used to cameras following her every move, but no amount of paparazzi could prepare her for the man who breached the walls of her gated mansion. In 2018, her worst fears came true. A 37-year-old man broke into her community and scaled the mountainside behind her home, making his way to her property. This wasn't his first attempt to get close to her, but it was by far the most terrifying. Jenner's security team found the man hanging out by her pool, but he fled before police could arrive. Days later, he returned, and this time, he was caught. The psychological impact was immediate. Her sense of safety shattered. The place that once felt secure and luxurious was now filled with fear, as Jenner had no idea who might lurk next. Despite her wealth and status, the experience left her deeply shaken. Though the man was arrested, the emotional scars of the invasion remained long after the physical threat was gone. Jenner took legal action to protect herself, but the constant fear of future incidents became part of her reality, making her feel more vulnerable than ever. Keira Knightley's life spiraled into chaos in 2016. A man, convinced they shared a psychic connection, began stalking her relentlessly. Mark Revell wasn't content with just sending bizarre letters. He genuinely believed they could communicate telepathically. Things took a dangerous turn when he started showing up at her London home, blaring loud music and screaming her name. Neighbors were alarmed, but it was Knightley who was living in fear. Revell's delusion that they were destined to be together left Knightley in constant fear for her safety. She managed to get a restraining order, but that didn't stop him. Revell switched gears and took his harassment online, now stalking her through social media and bombarding her with disturbing messages. It wasn't just at her front door anymore. Now he could reach her anywhere, anytime through her devices. Even though Revell was eventually arrested and convicted of stalking, the damage had been done. Knightley had to bolster her home security and make serious changes to her daily life. From adjusting her public appearances to changing her routines, she was forced into a state of hyper-awareness. Selena Gomez faced something far more sinister than just personal risk. She received terrifying death threats from a man who believed that no one else could have her. Gomez, whose massive fan base made her accustomed to obsessive admirers, found herself in a situation that escalated to frightening extremes. For years, she was targeted by Che Cruz, a man who didn't just send her disturbing messages. He made repeated and bold attempts to invade her personal space. His behavior worsened to the point where he broke into her home, shattering any sense of safety. Cruz's actions spiraled further in 2014. He was arrested twice in 1 week. He was first caught after breaking into Gomez's guest house, sentenced to just 45 days in prison, and shockingly released after only 2 days. Within hours of his release, Cruz violated a court order, jumping the fence at her Calabasas home and attempting to get even closer to her. Despite multiple arrests, Cruz wouldn't back down. He held on to a twisted belief that he and Gomez were destined to be together, and that if he couldn't have her, no one else could. The severity of his threats forced Gomez to file multiple restraining orders against Cruz. Yet even with legal measures in place, the anxiety and fear Gomez lived with were overwhelming. No matter the court rulings, the fear of what Cruz might do next never fully disappeared. And while her story is terrifying, Ariana Grande faced a stalker who took things one step further by showing up at her house armed and ready to confront her. In 2021, Grande's life was put in immediate danger. A man named Aaron Brown appeared at her Los Angeles home, brandishing a large knife. Brown had been stalking her for months, making multiple attempts to get close to the pop star. When security guards approached him, he refused to leave and waved the knife aggressively, now demanding to be let in to see Grande. The confrontation escalated quickly, but fortunately, her security team managed to intervene before things took a darker turn. Brown was arrested by police soon after. He was charged with felony stalking and making criminal threats. This frightening incident wasn't the first time Grande had been targeted by an obsessive fan. Just a year earlier, another individual breached security, leaving a threatening note at her front door, further unsettling the singer. With these repeated invasions of her personal space, Grande was forced to increase her security measures. The mental strain of knowing she was constantly being watched, followed, and targeted took a severe toll on her well-being. After the 2021 incident with Brown, Grande was granted a temporary restraining order, which legally barred him from coming near her, her family, or her property.